to the Backstage Creative, the podcast that focuses on the people who work behind the scenes of theater. My name is Krista Copper. On this podcast, I interview stage managers and sound engineers and designers and musicians and music directors and choreographers, all of the people who work so hard and put so much passion and time and love and energy into creating incredible live performances. I have been involved in theater for over 10 years by this point, and I love it. I love the collaboration and all of the problem solving and teamwork that goes into creating a live show. I always leave at the end of a production feeling so inspired and just so encouraged. And even, as a musician, I play the same show a lot of times over and over and over, but it never gets old. There's something about a live performance with lights and costumes and music and all of the elements that go into specifically musicals that I'm crazy about. I also really like talking to people that don't get as much attention. There's so many podcasts out there that interview actors and directors and, talk about specific shows on Broadway. But I think there's so much that all of us involved in theater can learn from people who do different work than we do. And that's the goal of this. One of the goals of this show is to help everyone in theater in whatever capacity you're involved with be able to do your job better. If you understand more of what everyone else is doing around you, then that can affect your job in positive ways. And so that's one of the goals of this podcast, is just to create space for people to talk about their jobs and to help us all understand each other better in the theater world. Today is my conversation with Kate Sutton-Johnson, who is a scenic designer. This conversation is deep and honest, and I had a great time doing it. I also had a good time editing it, which is, I don't really enjoy editing. Most of the time, since this podcast comes out on Tuesday, most of the time I'm doing my editing either on Sunday or Monday, depending on what I have going on. And I don't always look forward to it, not because of the conversation or the people I'm talking to, but it's just kind of tedious and it feels like it takes a while, and you're just staring at a computer screen, which I don't know. It's just not very exciting. But this conversation was so good that I was actually looking forward to editing this week. And so I know that you'll get a lot out of it. So here we go. Here's my conversation with Kate Sutton-Johnson. So how have you been keeping yourself busy during, the past, I don't know, like 5 or 6 months?
Yeah, well, I think I have had, I guess, maybe a little bit of a different experience than a lot of other theater artists in that I work in two different worlds. So I do a lot of theater, but I also design museum exhibits. And I work with a company called Split Rock Studios. And we are a firm that designs and builds museum exhibits all over the country. And so I have remained employed and actually have been extremely busy working on my exhibit work. So that has been good. I feel really lucky to not be facing what, again, a lot of people that are totally full-time theater people, actors and designers are dealing with, which is like not only not work right now, but a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen with that work coming back. So I have quite a bit of stability because I have this other way in which I do creative design work. But, I guess the double-edged sword to that is my company has had some cash flow problems because some of our contracts got delayed. Our clients, which are mostly nonprofit institutions, were not able to proceed as planned with some of their projects because of fundraising constraints and things like that. And so we had to tighten our belt and we did lay off some people. And so that meant that the people remaining had to pick up a lot of balls that were dropped. And so, if anything, I have been uncomfortably busy during this time, which is a whole nother set of things to deal with. I think it's hard to probably not have a lot going on, but it's also hard to be working as intensely as I have been because there's been a lot to process. And I have been working some really long hours and not had weekends off and things like that. And so I've been feeling very depleted during this time period.
Yeah, I bet. How does your work doing design for museum exhibits? How does that affect what you do in theater?
That's a great question. Working in both of those industries has made me a better designer in both industries. So I learn things in the museum world that I bring back to the theater world and vice versa. So, in the theater world, production shops are so nimble and like they have such a can-do attitude, and are often the masters of illusion, like how to make something look good from totally believable from 30 feet away or whatever. But there's also this really like temporary nature to all of it, right? So we're building things that look good for a time, and we know we can tell the actors not to touch something if it's not stable. Whereas in the museum world, everything I design, I have to anticipate visitor behaviors that I can't control. And the shelf life of those projects is like 20 years. And so I'm designing things where people can do whatever they want inside the environments to a degree. Obviously, people can't do anything they want without getting reprimanded by a museum staff person, but we have to anticipate that if something looks climbable, someone will probably climb it, and that things need to be made out of really durable materials. And so I learned kind of like a whole other set of construction methods by designing in this museum world that demands like a different kind of problem solving. But then that has been interesting to kind of bring some of that back into theater because there are techniques that don't tend to be used in theatrical design, and that a lot of production shops aren't familiar with. And so sometimes I'll sort of throw into the mix, like suggesting doing something a certain way or building it out of something that is maybe a little bit unique. And then, in the museum world, sometimes we can get kind of same thing, sort of stuck in like a set way of doing things. And sometimes that theatrical background and the knowledge about how you can create an illusion or do something that's like pretty low tech that can achieve like a really have a lot of dynamite impact with not a lot of money and not a lot of time. And so a lot of times I'll kind of try to bring that into my museum work. So I just feel like it's given me a much broader toolkit, and theater has such a sense of play. And so it's really fun to kind of bring that into the museum world too, like not just in the production end of things, but even in just like the idea of visitor experiences and like storytelling and what that audience might want to have in a social experience like a museum where you go in and you're usually with your family members, or if you're a kid you're with a caretaker, and you're going to have conversation about what you're doing. And it's trying to sort of create experiences that are memorable and meaningful to people after they leave, that they keep talking about. That's a really fun challenge to kind of suck them into something like that.
Mhm. How do you know when you've been effective?
That's a great question. I mean, if I think about effective design work that's for the stage, I would say for me, I feel most effective when I feel like I have made the actors feel really empowered to tell the story without any sort of friction between them and the world in which they feel they inhabit in their character. So, if the setting for the play or musical sort of psychologically is like resonant with what the characters are experiencing, and also if it on a purely functional level is highly functional and has everything that they need in an appropriate scale, which isn't maybe as sexy but so important, that like stair treads aren't too high, and the doorway that they need to get to isn't too far from where they need to get for a very particular entrance. So like understanding kind of the power dynamics at work in a ground plan, and the way in which you can kind of make an actor's job easy, as easy as possible. Obviously, the job of an actor is not easy, but just I love to feel like I have removed friction from their experience of just telling the story to the audience. Sometimes that means that the set is like a full character in the show because that is what supports the story. And sometimes the set maybe has less presence, and that's what's needed. And so then there's pride in that being the right thing to have done. So in some ways, I guess it's kind of trying to like sort of have my point of view take up less space, I suppose, like to really, really, truly
Mm,
respond to the story and to provide to the staging of the story what makes it most powerful in the end.
I like that. So take us through, I'd love to hear about your design process. So someone calls you up and says, "We want you to design the sets," and you agree. And how do you get to tech week and opening night? What does that process look like?
Yeah. So my process always begins with reading the script, assuming that there is a script and it isn't devised work or something like that. If there's sort of a script that's being used as the departure point, then I familiarize myself with that text. And again, if there's a score like opera or musical, I would listen to that music pretty exhaustively, particularly when designing with music. I really feel like transitions with scenery are highly choreographic and need to time with the music. So I would really study the music at the beginning to understand the sense of flourish that a transition is asking, that what is the music asking for in that transition? Like, do we land on one thing and then the next and then a final button? And so that does there need to be kind of like three beats in that transition? Or is it sort of a swirl of music? And so the kinetics that music is demanding are, swirling. I just feel like the music usually tells me something about like the nature of the way that the set needs to move if it moves. If it's a text based thing and it's a play, then I would say, again, I just read that script many times to try to, in some ways, kind of commit to memory all the different puzzle pieces that I'm needing to juggle and solve at once through the design. Because I do think that ultimately a set design is a puzzle. You're sort of being asked to puzzle out a space that can either transform in many ways, or if it's a unit set, a space that can transform through light. And again, like either hold the psychological tone of each scene, or maybe transform through lighting effects to be sort of different places in a cinematic way. So yeah, that would be for sure my first step. And then early discussions with the director that I'm working with would also be something that would happen right away. And then I go into a pretty exhaustive research phase, which is mostly visual research, although depending on what subject matter I'm working on, I would also do sort of more dramaturgical research, reading about the time period that's relevant. And if it's a play or musical about real people, that real historic figures, then I would potentially do some research on my own about those people as well. And then I would kind of take that research, and if the director and I sifted through it and were able to kind of pull out, I don't know, 10 to 20 images that felt like we were really excited about those images, then I would kind of run with that and start to develop just some initial ideas. And I always say that any first concept sketch of any sort, or a first crude model piece, or however it is that I first begin to put something on paper, I always say that that first thing is purely something to throw darts at, because the first thing you create visually is just something that is meant to react to, I feel like. So I definitely like to work in that way where I'm not like wanting to get something too far along before bringing my collaborator back to the table to kind of react to kind of my first impulse.
Hmm. I like that as a musician. I like that you mentioned the importance of music in your process. I don't think I've ever talked to a set designer who's mentioned that, and they may do that and just didn't say it. But I think that's very interesting that you pay so close attention to the music when you're thinking about the sets.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I feel like, the transitions are so important in any show. I mean, I think that's like, if you see a show that's been directed by a director who maybe thought about the transitions last, I always feel like that is such an obvious thing to an audience, at least for me. And obviously I'm an audience member that has seen a lot of theater, but a lot of theater patrons are people that have seen lots of theater. So I think, we have to treat our audiences like they are very savvy. But
Mm.
whenever I see a show that where transitions feel like they weren't kind of at the heart of the design solution and kind of at the heart of the director's vision of how we deal with like moments in the show when the story kind of moves forward in some way, if there's not kind of a real point of view about that, and a way in which that carries us forward really energetically to the next thing, as opposed to making the audience feel like we're waiting, for the next thing. I really think that the artistic team has failed the play. And also again, the actors. I mean, I think that's why when you ask me like what makes me feel like I've done a good job, it's when the actors have absolutely everything they need and they aren't dealing with what happens when the set doesn't do what it's supposed to, which is let's say there's a transition and we're just waiting for the set to move and everyone in the audience knows we're waiting because clearly the set isn't timed with the music. It's not driving the momentum forward. It's out of step with the psychology of the moment, which is if it's a musical, it's probably carrying us somewhere and we're still tumbling towards that next thing or we want to be taken to the next moment. If the audience isn't still on the ride and they're waiting, then the actors have to rebuild that energy when they come back to begin the next scene. They've lost the energy of the audience and people have disconnected from the story. So I just think those transitions are so critical to keeping everyone inside that abandonment that happens where you just have given yourself over to the story. You want to hold everybody in that kind of magical circle all the time.
I love that. That's something I'm gonna be paying more attention to the next time I see a show.
Cool. Yeah, good.
So then, what do you have a favorite part, or a favorite, yeah, a favorite part of the process?
Well, I mean, I would say that there are parts that I mean, I love the whole process. I really do. And I feel like the longer I've done this, the more I sort of like find it remarkable that I have been doing something for almost my whole career that is deeply fulfilling and satisfying to me. I mean, I really got lucky and did something that I love to do and I'm still doing. And in some ways, like the more I do it and the more I sort of hone the craft of doing it, the more satisfying it is. So I feel like my love for doing this work like deepens over time. But I would say that there are parts that are, like, still pretty challenging in a way that borders on excruciating. Like, there are moments where, like, creative uncertainty is still, like, a very difficult moment in the process, and I feel like I hit that little speed bump, which used to be a major speed bump, and now that I've been doing this a long time, it's a much, much smaller speed bump because I have a lot of faith in myself to figure out what the design will be. I don't, like, question whether or not I have the ability or capacity to like figure it out. I assume like I will get there. I'm just not there yet. And I have learned that you cannot schedule a breakthrough as much as I would love to say by 4 p.m. I will have had the breakthrough that I need. And so you're just kind of waiting for that like creative blissful moment and but I've learned that there's lots of techniques I've been able to figure out over time that work to set me up to have that breakthrough moment. So while I can't schedule right when it will happen, I can at least create all of the framework that sets me up to have success inside the process. And I've developed that process over many years. So I would say like there's that part that's sort of like not fun, but then in some ways then when you do kind of crack that egg, it's like really satisfying because you're like you get amped up because you're like, "Oh, I've figured it out. Like this is the nugget I have been waiting for. This is like the thing I could not see, but now it's like suddenly kind of the pieces have started to click together and I'm starting to like lock in a few things and now suddenly like other things can click in because I've made a couple of decisions and I feel like those decisions feel right. And so then like all of a sudden it sort of gets you down a track where you feel like you're saying a lot more yeses and rather than just like, sort of like saying no to all your quote dumb ideas. I do, at the beginning of the process, there's a lot of sort of like, no, that's probably not going to work because of this. And no, that's probably not going to work because of that. And of course, like we don't have enough money to do that or, and on and on and on, all the things that happen when you're kind of beating your head against the wall. But I will say that on every process, it is always really fun for me as a set designer when we get to build and then building the set and then teching the show. Because to be honest, like at that point, my design work involves such a large team. Like I'm going to build I'm going to figure out the design, but then the team expands exponentially as we go into production. And so I love like suddenly being part of this larger group and in a way kind of not being on the hot seat anymore, right? So like my excruciating vulnerable moment is over. I've got the design on paper and I'm not like I'm not wrestling anymore with like the big questions. And at that point I'm fine tuning and answering lots of detailed questions from folks about, did you mean this or that or now we're building this and we wonder if you want it this way or that way, and so I'm kind of in more of like a dialogue with folks that are on the construction end of the process. And then in tech, again, like the lighting designer and the sound designer are the people that, of course, in tech are like really under the gun. Like their whole process or a lot of their process is happening kind of under the microscope of the clock ticking in a tech period. And they're doing their work furiously. And I'm always like absolutely amazed that at the poise of those designers in those disciplines that are able to sit in the dark with, all the pressure of everyone on stage kind of waiting for them to get caught up and they're able
Uh-huh.
to like work under those in that intensity. But for me, like I love sitting in the dark and again just like being like I'm seeing everybody's work come together and I'm seeing the actors deepen their characters as they like get into their costumes and makeup and wigs and you just sort of feel everyone sink into like what it is that you've been planning for this thing to be for so long. And at that point, like as a set designer, I mean, yeah, I'm running up on stage a lot and I'm fussing with props and I'm still answering questions. It's not like there's nothing to do, but there's also a way in which I can kind of observe more that part of the process because again, I'm kind of less under the gun to be making like a million decisions. And so it's just fun. It's just fun to be in the room and like seeing all the things come together. It's so satisfying to see it working.
Yeah, yeah, I love that moment when it's just kind of something clicks and everything is like in harmony, the music and the sets and the costume and lights. I think that's such a like you can feel it.
Oh my gosh, yes, and I mean, like, for when I do a big musical and there's a full pit orchestra, I mean, I'm telling you, Krista, like, that first time that the orchestra comes in and, they've been, like, rehearsing in some room somewhere and you haven't heard them, and the conductor, like, basically starts playing the overture and you hear it in the theater for the first time, like, I wanna, like, do a lap around the room. I get so stoked 'cause it's just so exciting to hear, like, something that you've been listening to on your computer and you've been like slaving away with the director and figuring out like how all this is going to work and then when you hear that downbeat and like 25 instruments like swell and you hear the music being played live, it is so damn exciting. And that's like before we
Right.
even have an audience. Like I'm totally into it. I mean, I'm obviously like a theater person, hook line and sinker.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So you mentioned techniques that you had in place to help you when you're artistically stuck. Would you mind talking about some of those techniques that you've developed?
Sure, yeah. So I've actually done a little bit of reading about creativity and what sort of our brains need to be creative. And I've just kind of taken nuggets of things I've read that have resonated deeply with me in particular, and some of the things that I feel like were for me in the past, kind of things that would derail me. And I've tried to be more conscious about that. And so I think like maybe the cliffs notes of how I would describe my overall technique of harnessing a process that works for a creative person is that when I feel like I am getting overwhelmed by the process, which is certainly something I experience in those moments where I don't know yet what the design is going to be, it's easy to sort of just feel like, oh my gosh, like this is such a huge project and I'm nowhere. I'm at the beginning. What do I do? What I have basically come to over time is that when I get into that mode, I need to actually like focus on process more than that individual project, if that makes sense. And so in those moments where I'm feeling self-doubt, I kind of go to a more like by the book process and focus on what that is. And so that can be a number of things. It can be going back and reading the script again and just saying like I just need to, if I'm feeling like I don't quite have all of this in my mind's eye yet, then I need to go back and be in the world of the text again. Or it might be, what is something I can do right now? If I can't solve the set today and I'm feeling anxious about it, what if I just let my mind wander and I build my model box because that needs to happen anyway? And why delay that? I might as well build that right now and let my mind just daydream while I'm doing that. Or like what's something else I can move into and do that's productive and has to happen, but that maybe isn't again the aha moment or the breakthrough moment that is so hard to just like summon. So I mean that's basically those are the sorts of things I do. I mean the other thing I do is scheduling blocks of my time to do specific things, and that just kind of keeps me moving forward. So sometimes I'll say like, I'm just going to work for a half an hour on this thing, and then whenever that 30 minutes is up, I'm just going to move on to this other thing. And sometimes bouncing around across different things is also like really helpful. One of the things that I've read about in reading about kind of the creative brain and how it works is that stepping away is critical, like not having it so close to your face all the time, having time to marinate is important, but also like getting yourself to step away and to look at images or to expose yourself to other types of art, that it could be anything, film or dance or whatever the case may be, but something kind of seemingly disparate from what you're working on, but perhaps surreal, or something that's kind of that can maybe like knock loose something creatively about whatever the other thing is that you're working on. And so bringing in some kind of like influence creatively from some other avenue can also be really helpful. And even if it seems disparate, you might find something resonant in it with what you're trying to do. So I don't know, there's just these different ways that I kind of bounce around inside of some process things that I have found work for me, so that I don't just get like really stuck in kind of the writer's block equivalent of set design.
I heard a quote once, and I would love to get credit to this whoever said this, but I cannot remember who said it. But they said action begets clarity, and I think sometimes you just need to do something, and then that clarity, that idea, like that nugget comes.
Totally. I have a really clunky quote that I did say this to a colleague one time. She was, I think, doing her own project and was feeling like she was having a very difficult time managing her anxiety and her process. And I said, sometimes if I'm having trouble focusing, I just focus on focusing, which is kind of a clunky way of saying what I sort of just said in a great many more words to you about kind of going back to process again, divorcing yourself from like the thing you're trying to solve and just focusing on, well, what makes me focus? Like what removes clutter, or what makes me lean into this subject matter more? Or like the other thing I talk about a lot is like when you're really fully in the world, like, and that's why I read the script so many times, but when you're really fully in the world and you feel like you're kind of inside it, I always think of it as like going underwater. Like you've been kind of swimming in the ocean or the sea or whatever that is the play, but when you actually like get your head underwater and you're really in it, like that's when those breakthroughs happen. So how can you create an atmosphere of focus so that that can happen?
That's good. Focus on focusing.
Focus on focusing. Yep. I mean, again, not eloquent. This is why I'm not going to be quoted for that ever in the world. But yeah, that's my thing. Focus on focusing.
I love talking about creativity so much. Like, what books have you read about that, or authors or articles? Like, how do you've mentioned like researching creativity in your brain and whatnot. What resources did you use to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, some of them are probably sitting near me in this room that I'm in right now. I know one time I read an article, and it's probably in here as well. It was basically like sort of debunking this modern day thing that we think we can do called multitasking. And I found that article like super fun and interesting, and I've shared it with students when I've done little masterclass things and stuff. Just that, the idea of multitasking, which I think is the modern human considers like the holy grail, and that if you're really a productive person, you've mastered this thing called multitasking. And this article talks about how like that is not a thing, and that human brains really do not do that, that you focus on one thing at a time. And so the idea that if you're kind of juggling a bunch of things at once, that you're probably doing most of them badly, or not as successfully as you could had you put your focus to them one at a time. So that's like one example of, there's one thing to bounce around, like I was saying a moment ago, maybe scheduling time and just committing that you're going to kind of work on things briefly and move around from one thing to the next. But to try to actually truly multitask by reading the play and listening to the music and drawing or something at the same time, like I don't know, maybe other people can do all of those things, but I tend to like to put my full focus towards one thing at a time. I find that I can feel much more focused and successful in having like real comprehension of what I'm trying to absorb if I'm really giving it my full attention. And there is a book I've read on creativity, and I don't know where it is, but I can of course share the title with you later. But it is really fascinating. And there's a few other articles that I've read that I'm sure I found online, but it's something I have talked to students about before when I've worked with them of just I feel like when I was in undergrad, I my workload was intense. I went to the North Carolina School of the Arts, and the program was really demanding, and I really had to learn time management, and I had to learn how to, do a pretty heavy workload as a designer. Even though a lot of it was paper projects, I was having to work at a pretty aggressive pace on projects, and so that was great. I mean, that really trained me for what it is like to do this as a career. So when I work with younger people now, like sometimes that's something that I focus on because I feel like if they can gain that skill while they are in kind of the safety of an academic setting, that it will help them when they get out. That there's very few theater artists that are working on just one thing at a time. We are usually having to figure out how to split our focus, where we're working on one project for part of our day and then another later, and maybe having a meeting about a third. And that all happens in one day. And you have to be able to kind of hold that without going crazy.
Mhm. I would imagine, like, as a set designer, a lot of times you're the team leader, right? You're the one with the idea and the plans. Talk about leadership. When you're in a leadership position, what are things that are important to you? How do you build a cohesive team? Yeah, big question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, so I would say that in terms of being a leader, yes, you're right. Inherently, set designers are kind of in roles where they're overseeing quite a large undertaking. Building a set is often a pretty large scale build, and you're also communicating and kind of managing the process of what the paint treatments will look like and also what the properties will look like. So you've got to really hold together a unified vision and get people's buy-in with how you want things done. And at the same time, like, I firmly believe that the work is far better when the artists and craftspeople, fabricators that are working on the process not only care about what they're doing and care about the product being good, but also can bring impact to the work. So in other words, like if I'm working with a scenic artist particularly, if that scenic artist is, kind of bringing to the table like their own artistry, and they have a way of approaching a treatment or something that I suggested, and they have a way that, they throw into the mix. Well, what if we did this? Or would you be open to that? A lot of times I'm super excited to kind of expand upon an idea that I had initially that may have been too limited. And so I love it when it feels like inside the production process, the original design expands in small ways and kind of becomes more fine-tuned and more interesting because of the skills of the people that are making it all come to fruition. I would say that as a woman in this field, I really struggled with some of those relationships early on because I was working with lots of men, and there were often times where people were not a huge fan of having a young woman come in to the shop to give instructions about things or to consult or provide opinions about things underway. And so that was obviously not a super fun experience, but I learned a lot from those experiences. And I would say that some of my experiences early on, where I had a lot of difficulty in that regard, though painful, taught me to be quite savvy about some things. So I worked in some very large union houses early on, and I developed some skills for how to come into those settings and to work with those teams of people that enabled me to have camaraderie with those groups of people. And so I would say across the board, having a sense of humor is like a huge, huge asset. So anytime you can, whatever, make fun of yourself, make fun of the situation, develop a rapport with a new person that you're working with to the degree that you can start poking fun at each other. Um, any way that humor can be a part of the dynamic in these situations where, you're working intensely on things, the better. And a lot of times, some of the most curmudgeonly people can be won over if you can figure out how to make them laugh. I would say now things are quite different for me in terms of a leadership role because I have been doing this a very long time and I'm very knowledgeable and I know all the tricks in the book of like the ways that men can treat women in this job, and I can see the BS a mile away, and I am very good at navigating it, and I'm very proud of the fact that I have figured out many ways to move through my work in a way that is without any sense of apology for my whatever, like my lack of knowledge or anything that I used to sort of feel like I would get sort of like, there's that kind of like gotcha moment that people love to do where they sort of catch you having made a mistake in your design or something and they sort of ram it down your throat or make you feel like, you're an idiot. And, I used to feel really banged up by those situations and feel a lot of shame around having messed something up. And, now I just think making mistakes is human. And if I mess something up, I'm actually quite eager to know what it was because I'm going to keep learning about this job for my entire career. There's never going to be a day that I don't probably learn something new. So I think like part of it is that I very, very rarely feel any sort of defensiveness now about any design choices that I make. It's not that I don't get annoyed at myself for having maybe done something I wish I'd done better, but that's on me. That's my own experience I'm having with myself. I very rarely feel like colleagues that I'm working with are that they exert that sort of power over me. And I think it probably just becomes like a feedback loop that like having sort of fixed the problem of feeling vulnerable to it, I behave probably differently than I did previously. And so that makes me like sort of less likely to even experience those things, if that makes sense. So I think like because I am not as vulnerable, I am less picked on.
Hmm.
If that makes sense. And because I'm not just behaving confidently, but because I feel settled and at ease in a different way, I think that again, I'm just not as attacked or yeah, I'm not bullied as much as I used to be. Anyway, I mean, I think what's missing in a lot of production shops too is like, well, what's missing in the workplace in general, in lots of workplaces, is like emotional maturity and kindness and enthusiasm for your fellow collaborators and teammates for their differences and what they're doing and what makes their job unique from yours and things like that. So those sorts of things come easily to me because I genuinely think that everybody is important in the process and I genuinely want to know how everyone's experience is on the project. And so I tend to just ask a lot of questions and I think that creates personal connection between me and the people working. I think I've had a lot of people say that, like in the regional theater world, like designers come out and they're on their phone or they're on their computer, they're designing the next show. They're not really like getting to know anyone or talking to anyone. And I think just the fact that I like have a genuine interest in like the people that are there at that theater and how they are and what they're all about and then specific to the project like what they're building and how it's going, and if something isn't going well, I'm, like, really eager to know if there was something about the design that made it difficult, and, so I really solicit a lot of critique, and so, I don't know, there's just a lot of things like that that I feel like create connection and show people. I think I just sort of model through my lack of, feeling like I'm scared for mistakes to be revealed or something. I don't know, I think people respond to that. So I don't know, that's maybe not a very eloquent answer to what you asked, but maybe the cliffs notes to all of the things I just said are that I have found that the more I am able to be my authentic self, the better of a leader I am.
I loved everything you just said.
Well, great. Yeah, I mean, I just, when the whole thing about emotional maturity, I mean, I think for women, we don't, there's been such a, for me, I did so much like male imitation in the early part of my career, like just trying to be whatever I viewed this kind of like workplace masculine leadership ideal to be, which is to sort of whatever be, to never be wrong, to be assertive, to always be right, all these things that are just stupid. And the more I feel like I bring to the workplace like feminine power, I suppose, which is like sensitivity and care and vulnerability, all of those things have served me so well in being a leader.
Hmm. I'm often in working with a lot of men, and I've discovered, if I go in thinking to myself, like, I have nothing to prove, like, I'm good at my job and I don't need to put anyone else down to prove that, I can go and I can do my job well, and that usually will win people over. But if I go in with this posture of, look how good I am, and, you're lucky to have me in this pit and all this stuff, that's where the trouble comes, which is pretty much what you're saying too, is like, you have nothing to prove, you're
Yep.
good at your job and you can just come in and do it.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep. Absolutely. And, I think we all make mistakes. And so I think like I
Mhm.
also try to, in the same way I invite critique of my work, and I really do mean that. Like I ask people a lot to provide me feedback on the design and what it meant for them on the tail end of it. Cause everything rolls downhill, right? Like there's a lot of decision makers. And ultimately the people that deal with the decisions are the people that are trying to make it real. And so I want to know how I either have empowered those people to have a nice, easy process, or at least a process that's quite successful, or if they have felt sort of like they were defeated before they even began and why they felt that way. Like, did I present some kind of challenge that was just, unfair? Or is there some way that I, could have designed something to make it a little easier that still would have made me feel like I got the result I was looking for? So anyway, there's that kind of, soliciting critique that I'm doing with other people, but what happens is then that makes, because I'm not taking that feedback personally and I'm so open to it, it helps me when I need to tell someone else something that maybe is difficult. Like if I need to say, we need to do better about this next time, and there's, an opportunity to kind of talk about that, I find that people are much more able to be egoless about that because they know that like my eye is on how we can all be better and that there's a sense of like team in all of it, that it's not about like I'm going to pick you out in this meeting and embarrass you in front of all of our peers, but instead, it's like, we just talked about my mistake. And now I have like another thing I want to bring up that was between you and me that didn't go very well. So maybe it was like the person that drew like the CAD draftings and we together didn't catch something and it made its way out to the shop. So I sort of like want to talk about that with that person. But if I've just kind of owned something that was purely my deal, then I find that usually that person who I am sort of saying like, "Hey, you and I did this thing, like we should do this differently." Usually people don't get all huffy about it because I think they just realize that, it's more about clearly we're all going to make mistakes. We shouldn't There's no shame in that. We should just learn from it and do better next time. Those are some of my philosophies.
Yeah, I like those.
Mhm.
So you mentioned that you have been in this industry for a while. Have you seen anything change in the theater world since, either good or bad, since you started?
Well, it's an interesting question that you're asking right now because I feel like right now the theater is in a total upheaval, in response to a lot of longstanding social justice issues that I think are being really pondered very deeply in the theater community right now about how white artists can be better and do better. So I would say, I mean, I feel focused on that right now. I'm trying to think. I mean, my journey as a woman in this industry has definitely had evolution, and so I think from a personal standpoint, I certainly feel like the theater world that I live in right now is different because I'm different,
Hmm.
and the world is different. The world is different that we live in. I mean, I think the stakes feel high right now, and the stories that we are going to be telling as theater artists moving forward are going to feel urgent and important in ways that maybe they didn't when I first began, and things don't feel lighthearted right now.
Mhm.
But it's everything is changing so quickly, and I feel like there's just when you think you have a handle maybe on one of the great challenges that has appeared this year, another one presents itself that feels insurmountable. And maybe when we can get somehow on the other side of this to the point that we can gather again, maybe all people will want to see is like fluffy comedy that has no meaning because they'll be just so tired of like the heaviness of all of it. I don't know, but right now I feel like we need to tell stories that are addressing the world that we're facing. So yeah, I don't know. That question to me feels like so present as opposed to like reflective of like my 20 years in this business. So yeah, I would say mostly I just feel like my personal role in all of it feels different, and the fact that I have collaborators that I have worked with over the years that are now long-standing collaborators and dear friends. And so now when I often am starting a theater project, it's a reunion with a person that I've done many other projects with, and there's a shorthand there, and there's a deep admiration and love for the person that I'm working with. Whereas when I was early in my career, I was trying to just like meet some directors, it's just like I need to find some directors that want to work with me, and a lot of my projects with those directors were kind of trying to prove to them that I could earn their trust and that I would do good work. And so yeah, I'm just at a different place right now. So it certainly feels different. I feel like I start projects often with a team that I have a relationship with, and it allows us to kind of dig deeply into the work right away with a lot of established trust, and that's a beautiful thing.
What has kept you in theater when it's gotten difficult? Because I'm gonna go ahead and assume that there's been times in your career where you've maybe questioned or, thought about changing paths. And if not, that's cool. You're lucky. But what's kept you in theater for as long as you have been in it?
Sure. Well, I will just say that I know that you have spoken with some other set designers and through your podcast and other designers of other disciplines, but so maybe this has come up in some of those other conversations, but part of the challenge of being a theater artist, and one that I ultimately did pivot from, is being able to make a living. There is simply not a way that I was able to stay as a full-time set designer and survive. Not with the way that I feel I have to commit myself to the work that I am doing. I was not able to be a theater artist that could juggle 20 projects in a year with maybe, there were points in my career where my design fee for a project might be $2,000 for an entire design. And so if I were to do 20 projects, I could make 40 grand. And after taxes, take home maybe 30. And so I would still be kind of like trying to find out how I would get insurance. And I'm not a person that can do 20 set designs in a year. I dive into these projects with so much intensity, and I feel like to do the project and to feel like I've done the project to the degree that is at sort of my quality level, there is just no way I can do that many projects. I was doing, I think, 10 or 11 at a time at one point, and it just about killed me. So for me, I had to scale back on the amount of theater that I was doing, and I had to find a way to make enough money to live. And so that's not a very romantic way of talking about this industry, but it is absolutely a reality. And I know that there are set designers that are able to do it, but I could not sustain a career doing it because I just wasn't able to take on the workload that it would have required for me to make still kind of a poverty level income. So that is when I got into doing museum exhibit design. And so the balance that I have right now is that the museum exhibit work is what pays me a living. And then the theater work that I do, I take on as much as I possibly can, but I don't really worry about the money because honestly, it is still so insulting to be paid the low fees that you get as a set designer for the amount of work that it requires, at least with my process. I spend many weeks working on a show and hundreds of hours working on a show. And I think the last time I tried to calculate how much I was making per hour, it was under $4 an hour. That is the hard truth from my experience. That is my truth, is that I can't do it. I honestly don't. I don't know exactly how the people that are doing it. If they don't, I mean, there's such a tiny, tiny, tiny echelon of people that have Broadway credits and can have that passive income of having a design, having kind of made it, and they're getting royalties from that work. I mean, that is the holy grail in terms of a financially lucrative way of doing the business. Otherwise, I think people have to get into film or some other industry that pays more for this kind of design work. These design disciplines that, you're not paid hourly. And so I think, if I could come up with a process that was super truncated and I could somehow crank out a design in a much shorter amount of time, then obviously I would be more profitable. I could take on more work and I would therefore make more money per hour. But you get paid a fee. And for me, there is no real shortcut. Like I just go whole hog into the project. And if have not like committed myself to that degree, then I just can't, I just take it too seriously. So yeah, for me, I can't do it. I think there are probably people that can work more quickly, or I don't know. I don't know how they do it, but I can't.
I admire your integrity of sticking to your design process that you feel produces the best outcome.
Thank you. I've never thought about it as with the descriptor integrity, but I appreciate that a lot. I think it does feel like one of those things like that I know about myself. I can't. There's not really another way I could do it. Otherwise I would have done it because I love theater, and I even though I spend a great many hours being a museum exhibit designer now, I still think of myself as at heart I'm a theater artist. That is what I am best suited to do. It is the skill that I am best at, but I do it a lot less now. So
So, final question I like to ask everyone who comes on this show to give advice to young people who want to do what you do.
mm. Well, that's a hard question coming after what I just said, isn't it? Oof. Basically, I was just like, "Don't do it. You can't make any money." Um, Gosh, that's a great question. Well, here's what I will say. I think that theater artists are so highly skilled, like,
Mhm.
so highly skilled. Like, being in a theater program and learning all of the things that you have to learn to fundamentally, like, get the whole process and understand, like, how it is that a show comes together and how you create an epic human experience on stage in front of a live audience with all of the technical things that go into it and all of the time constraints and all of the interpersonal negotiations that happen in order to like navigate the needs of the actors and navigate the opinions of your fellow collaborators and on and on and on. All of the things that you have to do to be a theater artist are skills that the world desperately needs, period. And it's interesting, the arts are such a, like, right now I feel like people are acting at a governmental level like the arts are sort of an icing on the cake, that they're not essential or they're not crucial to our economy and also to our well-being and all of these things. But I disagree with both of those things. I think the economic impact of the arts is something I just think people are, I don't know why they're so. Anyway, that aside, theater artists are so incredibly valuable. And I wondered aloud actually to somebody yesterday about if people actually do leave the industry because of the pandemic, how lucky companies that are in other industries will be to get those theater people on their staff.
Yes.
Because those theater people are going, I mean, it doesn't matter what industry they go in, they will be so valuable to those industries. I just think theater people are so highly skilled. So I guess what I would say to young people is get a theater degree because it is valuable. And I don't know what the world holds and how we will all continue to make theater, but getting a theater degree will teach you so many skills and make you so nimble and so able to solve anything. I mean, theater artists can solve any problem. So that's what I would say right now. I don't know that there's a lot of certainty about like how to go about having a successful career in theater. I think it would be very unwise to try to read those tea leaves right now, but I do think that getting a training as a theater artist is a great primer for life.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Zach Rimbold.